Um, so if you'd like to give a quick introduction of your background and who you are, real quick before we get started, that'd be very nice.
Sure, yeah, I'm Bill Bolling, and I am former two-term lieutenant governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and now teach government and politics at the Schar School for Policy and Government at George Mason University.
Well, it's great to have you on today. I would just like to get started with a quick question about what are some of the major elections that you've been looking at this cycle that could possibly determine control of both the House and the Senate of the General Assembly?
Well, I think there are a number of races across the state that everybody's focused on. The bad news is most of the legislative districts in Virginia are not at all competitive. In the state Senate, we've got 40 districts. The balance of power in the Senate's probably going to come down to four or five of those districts. In the House of Delegates, really the same thing. We've got 100 districts, but the balance of power will probably come down to maybe a half a dozen of those races. So the races we've been watching are those races, four or five races in the state senate, five or six races in the House of Delegates. They all of these competitive races this year seem to be in suburban districts. There are a couple competitive races in the Northern Virginia suburbs, Loudoun, Fauquier, Prince William, the Fredericksburg, Stafford, Spotsylvania area. A couple competitive races in the Richmond suburbs, mostly Henrico and Chesterfield County. One important race down around Williamsburg and James City County and York County, and then a couple the same thing down at Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Suffolk. So it's these suburban outlying suburban districts where I think the balance of power is probably going to be determined.
Awesome, thank you. And what have been some issues that have been defining the campaign strategies for both the Republicans and the Democrats?
Well, that's a great question. Frankly, most of the TV ads and the material that you see from Democrats, it's all about abortion. It's all about alleging, truthfully or untruthfully, that Republicans want to ban abortion in Virginia. It's all about MAGA. Every Republican is a MAGA extremist, according to the literature and the ads that are being run by the Democratic candidates. On the other side, Republicans have tried to push back a little bit against that. Really, for the first time in the past, Republicans have really not said much about the abortion question, for example. But in this campaign, they're saying, "Wait a minute, we're not the extremists on abortion. We want reasonable limits on abortion." But it's the Democrats who are the extremists. They want to terminate pregnancies right up until the moment of birth. But those are the issues that have dominated the campaign. Unfortunately, neither party has really offered any kind of a vision for the future of Virginia, a contract with Virginia, if you will. Elect us, this is what we'll do. It's really on the Democratic side, it's been all about abortion. On the Republican side, it's been trying to push back a little bit on the abortion question. And we'll see if these approaches kind of resonate with the voters or not. I think both parties in this election have clearly run base mobilization strategies. The Democrats are just trying to rev up the Democratic base and turn them out. Republicans are trying to rev up the Republican base and turn them out. And we'll see today who does a better job of that.
Great. And I guess if we want to take it a little bit back to 2021, of course, the election of Governor Youngkin and the tenure of Governor Youngkin have been very important, defining traits of this election, so to speak. And a big issue for Glenn Youngkin in 2021 was parental autonomy in the classroom, both within school board elections, particularly in Loudoun and other places in Northern Virginia. And I'm wondering kind of how that issue's evolved throughout Youngkin's tenure and how it's really been shaping up with this election.
Well, Governor Youngkin has recently run some ads across the state on behalf of select Republican candidates, where he's talking a little bit about some of the things that he feels he's accomplished in the last couple of years. At the top of that list is restoration of parents' rights. So he certainly is trying to talk about that issue. Candidates, however, running for the Senate and the House haven't talked as much about it, frankly, as he has talked about it. And this election is very different than 2021. 2021 was a statewide election. There was a historic voter turnout in a gubernatorial election statewide in 2021. That will not be the case this year. Governor Youngkin won in large part because I call 2021 the revenge of rural Virginia. Rural Virginia really turned out in large numbers for Governor Youngkin. None of the competitive races this year are in rural Virginia. So it's all about these suburban localities. Certainly in a locality like Loudoun and Fauquier, Governor Youngkin did well there in 2021 on the parents' rights issue, and that issue has been somewhat paramount in a race that's taking place this year in Loudoun and Fauquier counties. But in other jurisdictions around the state, really not so much. Governor Youngkin has talked about it a lot. The other candidates really have not. You know, as someone who spent 22 years in elected office in Virginia as a Republican, I've been a little disappointed, frankly, that the Republican candidates haven't done a better job offering a specific vision. You know, elect us. This is what we'll do. It seems like they've played more defense than they've played offense in this election. But again, Democrats have not done that either. They've not offered a specific agenda either. It's been all about abortion and MAGA extremists. So it's kind of an election that's been void of real issue debates and discussions. It's just been red meat. Democrats trying to energize their base, Republicans trying to energize their base. They both know in a low voter turnout election, these base mobilization strategies really are the key to winning in these very off-year election cycles.
Great. And I kind of wanted to get into, the primary cycle that occurred throughout this June. For those that don't know, the Supreme Court passed a redistricting reform for Virginia during the reappropriations process due to the inability of the General Assembly to pass one. And the primary system and the primary races that happened were very costly in June, with a lot of long-term incumbents, including Fairfax's longtime senator since 2008, Chap Peterson, losing to Saddam Slim. And I'm wondering kind of like how that primary cycle has really been impacting this race so far.
Yeah, it certainly was different than most that we see. You correctly have pointed out because of redistricting, there were a much larger than usual number of incumbent Republicans and incumbent Democrats thrown into the same election districts. Republicans seem to manage that rather effectively in those areas where, for example, two Republican senators ended up in the same district. One of them retired and kind of deferred to the other one. But in the Democratic Party, we had some real knockdown, drag out, primary contests, particularly in Northern Virginia. That did result in the defeat of a couple very well respected, long serving members of the Senate. You mentioned Senator Peterson, but also Senator George Barker in Northern Virginia, who was affected by the same thing. Those races could create some divisions within the political parties that were impacted by them, and particularly the Democratic Party. But in those districts where these primary contests, these divisive primary contests occurred, they're really not competitive districts. So even if there are divisions in the Democratic Party, for example, in those two districts we've mentioned, the Democratic nominee is still going to win those districts overwhelmingly because they're 60, 65 plus percent Democratic districts. So I don't think what happened in June is going to have a lot of impact on what happens in November. The biggest issue today, I think, for both parties is who does a better job energizing and mobilizing their base. The last time we had all 140 seats in the General Assembly up for grabs would have been in 2019. And in the 2019 election, voter turnout was in the 35 to 40% range. So these are low voter turnout elections. Now, on the other hand, the turnout in the gubernatorial race a couple of years ago was 60%. So these are low voter turnout elections. People who vote tend to be more activist, Republicans or Democrats. They will have a disproportionate impact in the outcome of these races today. And again, I think that's why both parties have run these rather red meat campaigns. There hasn't been a lot of effort to reach out to more moderate, independent swing voters. It's mostly been about firing up the base of their own political party, again, because they know in a low voter turnout election, that really is the key.
Right, and kind of speaking to your point of kind of throwing the red meat to your base, partisan gridlock and political polarization have become a kind of unfortunate fact of Virginia's political life, especially with our most recent budget process kind of going way over what the General Assembly probably would have liked it to have been, based upon a lot of issues, and particularly social issues like LGBTQ plus rights or abortion, kind of not having any or very little overlap between the two parties and kind of what's that has that polarization what has that gridlock played what role has it played in the election thus far.
Well, I think it tends to just turn off a large percentage of more moderate and independent swing voters. These days, I don't think there's a lot of respect or appreciation for either political party among a large block of voters, and we consistently see that. If you look ahead to the 2024 presidential campaign, Democrats don't want Biden to be their nominee, but he probably will be, and a lot of Republicans don't want Trump to be their nominee, but he probably will be. So, and most people are just sitting back saying, really, in a country of 325 million people, this is the best that we can do. So I think you see that at the state level as well. I think a lot of people are just turned off by the political process. They've withdrawn to a great extent from the political process. That leaves the people with disproportionate influence to be these party activists, mostly, that tend to hold the most extreme views on the political left and the political right. These are the people they nominate to run for office. These people get elected to office. And then when they get elected to office, that partisan divide between Republicans on the one hand and Democrats on the other hand just gets deeper and it gets wider. And it's a vicious cycle that we've somehow got to figure out how do we break out of? How do we get back to where people who represent us in government are not ideological extremists of either the left or the right, but they do understand at the end of the day, government doesn't work without compromise and without efforts at consensus building. Right now, we don't see a lot of that coming out of either political party. I'm not sure we're going to see a lot of that in 2024 either, but maybe after we get the 2024 election cycle behind us, maybe we can get back to a more moderation in our public policy. But I guess that depends on what happens in 2024. So it's a challenging time for politics and for democracy. But there have been other times in America's political history where we've faced challenges, like this. And we've been able to endure them and we've been able to overcome them. And I think all of us, as we watch this, hope that we're able to endure and overcome this as well.
And you spoke a little bit on the political parties, and I'm kind of wondering what changes you've seen, and both ideological and geographical changes that you've seen within both party makeups that have kind of lended themselves both to the polarization and may further lend themselves to any impact on this election.
Well, I think all of the studies that have been done that we as political scientists talk about in our classes and to other groups, all of the studies that have been done have shown that over the last 20 years, the Republican Party has moved farther to the right, the Democratic Party has moved farther to the left. These activists within the parties that hold more extreme ideological views, more rigid ideological views, have grown in both power and influence. I don't see that changing in the short term. I think we've seen it getting progressively more dominant. I don't see it changing in the short term. The hope is it will change in the long run. The hope is that the cycle that we're in right now something will happen to break us out of this cycle and get us back to a point where more and more people who hold more moderate political views, who don't consider themselves maybe political ideologists or extremists of either the left or the right, get more engaged in the political process. There was a fascinating study done a few years ago by a group called More in Common, and it's called Hidden Tribes of America. And it talks about the fact that about two-thirds of the American people today have kind of checked out of the political process. This particular study called them the exhausted majority. They're just worn out by all of the extremism and the rigid ideologies and division that they see in politics today. We've got to figure out how to get that exhausted majority re-engaged to get politics back to a more centrist place. And that's why one of the passions that I have about teaching the next generation of political leaders is trying. A lot of this is going to be happen through education. Trying to get people to understand how government is supposed to work, the kind of approaches that have to be there to make government work the way the founders intended it to work. And a lot of that is about wrestling control of both political parties away from these extreme, rigid ideologies of the right and the left and empowering that exhausted majority again. That's what we all know needs to happen. It's what we all want to happen. Getting it to happen is a much more difficult challenge.
Right, and I guess a part that also plays in that polarization is both national figures and how the way national figures are spoken about within Virginia politics. And, in 2021, Terry McAuliffe spent a lot of his political capital talking about the possibility of a Glenn Youngkin Republican majority looking like a Donald Trump Republican majority, and kind of vice versa. Glenn Youngkin spent a lot of his time talking about how a Democratic victory would look like another inflationary period or continued inflationary period under a Biden-like Democratic Party from Terry McAuliffe. And I'm kind of wondering, how has that speech evolved in Virginia, and how has it really been playing into all of this, and how those national figures have been playing into all of this?
Well, the ideology, the polarization that we see in Virginia, of course, pales in comparison to what we see on the national level. It's much more intense on the national level than it is here in Virginia. But we've seen some of it here in Virginia. You referenced earlier the impasse between members of the House and the Senate. Democrats controlling the Senate, Republicans the House this year over the budget, a final budget agreement. So we've seen some of that here in Virginia. It's increasing in Virginia over time, but still nowhere near as extreme or as rigid or as combative as anything that we see on the national level. So hopefully our leaders will keep pushing back against that, trying to keep Virginia as focused on issues as we can, as focused on consensus building and compromise as we can. But that's clearly not the cycle of the day. That's not the cycle that we're in today, politically speaking. And I think leaders, if they want to be responsible leaders, just have to constantly be focused on what can I do to bring politics and policy back to a level that does focus on compromise and consensus building and tries to re-engage more and more people in the process. But it does require leadership that is committed to that type of a vision and an approach. And right now, it's hard to find that type of principled leadership, frankly, in either political party.
And earlier you spoke on your role as an educator in kind of combating this political polarization. And, um, what have you seen within the youth vote most energizing them, particularly those at Mason, as an educator who's kind of focused on that?
Well, that I think is the good news. We tend to sometimes focus on the bad news of the way things are, as opposed to the good news of maybe the way things could be. I do sense an understanding on the part of students in my classrooms that they understand that the way government is working today isn't the way that it needs to work. And I think there is a greater commitment and a greater focus on consensus building and compromise as opposed to political extremism. And that's what makes me optimistic about the future. That's what makes me think we can break these cycles and maybe get back to a time that we were in before. On the other hand, I worry sometimes that the younger folks for example, students that I teach at the university level today have grown up in an environment where they've never known government that worked, kind of all the way it was supposed to work. All they've known is this hyper politicized process that we seem to be in today. So I spent a fair amount of time just trying to say to my students, even though we look at government today, politics today, and we say, well, it's not working the way that it was intended to work, and I think that's largely true. Doesn't mean it's always been that way. There have been times where Republicans and Democrats who held passionate opinions about the important issues of the day were able to sit down and work together to find a compromise and build consensus. I often point to the decade of the 1980s when we had a very conservative Republican president, Ronald Reagan, widely regarded as the patriarch of the modern conservative movement for Republicans, and a very liberal speaker of the United States House of Representatives, a guy named Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts. But those two old Irish guys had the ability to sit down over a beer in the Rose Garden at the White House and come up with some amazing compromises on public policy. That was government that worked. In fact, it prompted Chris Matthews, who at the time was serving as the chief of staff to Speaker O'Neill, to write a book called Tip and the Gipper. And the subtitle of the book is When Government Worked. So we look at the way it's been maybe for the past decade, 10 or 15 years in our country, um, which has been a tough period of time for us, politically speaking and governmentally speaking, but it hasn't always been that way. That's the good news. And I still, maybe I'm naive enough to think we can still get back to that if we focus on trying to understand we're all entitled to our views on the important issues of the day, but our views are no more valuable or important than the views of people who may passionately disagree with us. We can learn from each other if we're really willing to sit down and try to figure out where the circles intersect on the big issues of the day. That's what compromise is about. That's what consensus building is about. That's what it takes to make government work again in a system that was designed to foster that type of compromise. We need to find that within ourselves again, and I think we can do that.
Right, and I think a large part of it is, we need to discuss those points of compromise. So I'm kind of wondering, where have you seen those circles overlap in Virginia politics over the split government throughout the past 2 years, and what policies have really been pushed by both parties and have been successful?
Well, I don't think there's any issue out there today at the federal level, state level, local level. There's not a single issue out there today where there's not some place that the circles overlap. And we just have to make a decision on, are we going to focus on the areas where we have disagreements, or should we focus on the areas maybe where we can find some element of agreement? If you look at the recent budget impasse in Virginia, that wasn't resolved until well after the current budget year started back in the summer in Virginia. There was a fairly big gulf between Republicans and Democrats about how they wanted to spend or invest certain resources that Virginia had. Republicans wanted to use that to cut taxes for families and businesses. Democrats wanted to use it to make further investments in programs that were important to them and to their constituents. Well, where the circles overlap, if you're willing to understand how government works, that compromise is necessary. Where the circles overlap is saying we got to do a little bit of both. to get the parties together, the sides together here, we're going to have a budget agreement that is going to provide some tax relief, which is what Republicans want to provide. It's also going to have to make some investments in some of these important programs, which is what Democrats want. Ultimately, that's exactly what they did, right? Ultimately, they reached an agreement by coming together with that type of compromise. It just took them longer to get there than it should have taken them, and I think a lot of that was just playing the political game to some extent with their base. But there's not an issue out there that faces us today that there isn't some place where the circles intersect. And one of the things I think we all need to do as Americans is understand how government was designed to work. And when you have a Democratic president, a Democratic majority in the United States Senate, a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, nobody's going to get everything their way. There has to be compromise. In Virginia, you have a Republican governor. Democrats control the state Senate. Republicans control the House of Delegates. Nobody's going to get everything they want. There has to be a compromise. Leaders need to understand that, but also activists within the political parties need to understand that. Activists within political parties cannot expect their agenda to be implemented 100% when the other party controls one of these other branches or level of government. So that's education, right? That's just educating people on the realities of how government works. And if we can do that, then the focus shifts away from who's going to be the partisan or ideological winner of this debate to how are we going to find where the circles intersect and actually forge policy. May not be everything Republicans want, may not be everything Democrats want. It's a little bit of both. How can we forge those policies to actually try chipping away at solving some of the problems that face the country today?
And I guess to wrap things up, the most important part of, or I guess the chief leader of party activism is the governor of the state or whatever the chief executive of the party is, which is typically the governor of the state. And I'm wondering what role Governor Youngkin is playing in this election, how much of this is referendum on him, and B, how much of Virginia elections in general are referendum on a governor in this, I guess, year before presidential cycle election.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in general, these types of General Assembly elections are seldom truly a referendum on the governor. These are usually local elections. They're driven more by local personalities and the strength or the weakness of local campaign committees and activities. There certainly can be times if you have a particularly unpopular governor or a particularly popular governor that they can influence the outcome in a district here or a district there. But largely speaking, it's probably not accurate to say that these are referendums on a governor. However, politically speaking, they're always viewed that way, right? So today, if Republicans retain control of the House of Delegates and win a majority in the Senate of Virginia, that'll be seen as a victory for Governor Youngkin, and it will be. He will have a Republican majority to work with in the next 2 years. Likewise, if Democrats say retain the Senate or win the House, that will be seen as a defeat for Governor Youngkin. But in reality, nothing will change. You'll still have a divided government. So if we emerge from today's elections with Democrats retaining control of one or both houses of the General Assembly, nothing really changes from a policy standpoint as long as you have a Republican governor. There's still uh, divided control. But if Republicans emerge with control of the governor's office and both houses of the General Assembly, that's a very different matter. And likewise, if Democrats emerge with control of both houses of the General Assembly, then the importance of the next gubernatorial campaign becomes great because then potentially they could elect a Democratic governor to go along with Democratic majorities in the General Assembly. So it'll be interesting to see how today turns out. My prediction is this. Whatever happens, it will come down to those few districts that we talked about. at the beginning of our discussion in both the Senate and the House, and it will be very close. Today, Democrats have a very narrow majority in the state Senate. Republicans have a very narrow majority in the House of Delegates. I don't think that's going to change. Whichever party emerges as the majority party, it's going to be one or two seats that separate the parties. I think in both the state Senate and the House of Delegates, it will continue to be very evenly divided.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on. Your insights are greatly appreciated. And yeah.
My pleasure. Anytime.